Imagine for a moment having a secret decoder ring, not just for, figuring out the daily news, but for really grasping the foundational truths, the things that shape everything in our universe.
That's a great analogy.
Well, today we're kind of putting on that ring for an incredible deep dive. We're looking into the very truth, the factual nature of the biblical text itself.
Right. And our mission really is to fully acknowledge and unpack the the biblical authority of Scripture.
Especially focusing on that declaration, the one that says God created the world in 6 literal days.
That's right. You are curious and, well, knowledge-seeking listener. You sent us your sources, and we've really distilled them down.
And this isn't just about, faith in some vague sense, is it?
No, not at all. It's about exploring how the Bible, when you actually take it as God's authoritative word, it provides this coherent, logical framework.
Framework for understanding everything. Science, history.
Exactly. Even the very nature of truth itself.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be looking at some powerful arguments that really challenge some long-held secular assumptions.
And reveal maybe some surprising alignments between, sound science and this ancient text.
That's the plan. There are some fascinating points where observable science seems to line up remarkably well.
So our goal for you, listener, is to offer a kind of shortcut. A way to get deeply informed on this really pivotal topic.
Yeah, get ready for maybe some aha moments and plenty of fascinating details that might just reshape your perspective on, well, the ultimate story of our universe.
Okay, let's dive in then. Let's unpack this first part. The unshakable foundation. Our sources present the Bible as, well, way more than just a religious book.
They absolutely do. It's framed as the definitive history book of the universe.
The history book of the universe. That's quite a title.
It is. And if you think about it, no other ancient text or even modern historical account really offers such a comprehensive and cohesive narrative. It's pretty unique in that sense.
So it covers everything from the very beginning.
Yeah. It details when time itself began, how and why sin and death entered what it describes as a perfect world, the catastrophic event of a global flood.
Which would have reshaped the planet.
Massively. And then the dispersal of humanity, the Tower of Babel, and it even outlines the universe's future destiny, culminating in a new heaven and new earth. That's a complete story, start to finish.
And the connection for you, our listener, is pretty profound then. If you understand the Bible this way.
It gives you a foundational worldview, right? A lens through which you interpret everything else.
So if it is the universe's history, the creator's own account, then it sort of dictates how we interpret everything else we observe. Fossils, stars.
Precisely. It becomes the ultimate context for reality. It informs how you approach all other knowledge claims.
Okay, connecting this to the bigger picture. God's eyewitness account. That's a key idea in the sources.
It really is. Unlike human historical records, which are always, fragmented, incomplete, maybe biased.
Subjective, yeah. Prone to error.
Absolutely. God is presented as the singular, perfect eyewitness to creation and all these other key events. And he's provided his infallible account right there in Genesis.
That's a powerful distinction to make. So if we accept this divine eyewitness testimony, how does that affect something practical, like the consistency of natural laws?
Yeah.
Because science depends on that, right?
Absolutely. And this divine eyewitness testimony isn't just some theological point floating out there. It's presented as the very basis for why we can expect nature to be consistent.
How so?
Well, think about the regular cycles, like seasons, day and night. Genesis 8.22 mentions this consistency after the flood. The reason we can expect these, and the reason the future operates consistently with the past, is because God, who is beyond time and unchanging, guarantees it.
Because he's upholding it all.
Exactly. His consistent character is what underlies the universe's consistent behavior. It's not just random luck that laws don't change moment by moment.
So, wait, the very foundation of science, this idea that experiments today will work tomorrow. You're saying that implicitly relies on this biblical worldview, even if a scientist doesn't believe it.
That's what the sources argue, and it's a significant point for understanding knowledge itself. The very existence of uniform laws of nature, which, let's be clear, are an absolute prerequisite for all scientific inquiry, it only really makes logical sense within this kind of framework.
Why wouldn't it make sense otherwise?
Well, think about it from, say, an atheistic perspective. If the universe is just the result of random, mindless processes, why should there be this deep underlying mathematical uniformity? There's no logical necessity for it.
So they rely on it, but can't really account for it from within their own worldview?
That's the argument. They are, in a sense, borrowing capital from the Christian worldview the expectation of order and consistency, even while denying the source of that capital.
That is quite a philosophical tangle.
Okay.
And it gets even more interesting when you look at the Bible's own claims about itself. Divine inspiration, inerrancy.
Right. The Old Testament prophets, for instance, they weren't just sharing, wise thoughts. They consistently said their words were directly from God.
Using phrases like, "Thus says the Lord."
Hundreds of times.
Yeah.
Over 400 times, actually.
Mhm.
They saw themselves as mouthpieces. You have Jeremiah 1.9 where God says he put his words in Jeremiah's mouth, or Isaiah 5 speaking for God in the first person. They were literally speaking God's message.
And this carried over into the New Testament. The writers there saw the Old Testament the same way.
Yes, definitely. You see Peter in Acts 4 saying God spoke through David. Paul in Acts 28 quotes Isaiah as God speaking. And crucially, they claim the same divine authority for their own apostolic writings.
Like Paul saying his words were taught by the Spirit.
In 1 Corinthians 2.32, yes. Not in words taught by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit. And Peter, in 2 Peter 3, puts the apostles' commandments on par with the words of the holy prophets. It's a consistent claim to divine origin.
That's a very bold claim. So when we talk about biblical inerrancy, the sources define that as God-breathed.
God-breathed, from 2 Timothy 3.16, and therefore factually true at every point, providing a reliable depiction straight from the God of truth.
And it gets specific. The example from Galatians 3.16, Paul bases an argument on a single word being singular, not plural.
That's right. He makes a major theological point about the promise to Abraham hinging on the word seed, singular offspring, referring to Christ, rather than seeds, plural descendants.
Wow. That really underscores this idea of verbal inspiration, doesn't it? That every single word matters.
It really does. It implies a precision that's, well, divine. Now, this inevitably brings up the issue of alleged contradictions, which critics often raise.
Right. If it claims to be perfect, how can there be contradictions? How do the sources address that?
It's a fair question. And the consistent answer is that these alleged contradictions disappear with proper contextual interpretation.
Like reading things out of context.
Exactly. The classic example is Psalm 14.1, there is no God. Critics quote that, but the full verse says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God.
Ah, so the Bible is quoting the fool, not stating it as fact.
Precisely. It's describing a thought, not making a declaration. The issue is almost always a failure to understand the genre, the historical setting, the author's intent, or the immediate context. It's usually a reading problem, not a text problem.
Okay, so context is king, but there's a deeper philosophical point here too, right? About the law of non-contradiction itself.
Yes, this is fascinating. The very law of non-contradiction, that A cannot be both A and non-A at the same time in the same way, is fundamental to all logical thought.
We needed to even argue about contradiction.
Right. But where does that law come from? The biblical worldview roots it in the unchanging rational nature of God himself. He's not contradictory, so reality, which he created, isn't fundamentally contradictory.
So when a critic uses logic to try and find a contradiction in the Bible,
They're implicitly using a standard of logic that only really makes sense if the biblical God exists. By arguing against the Bible using logic, they are, ironically, borrowing the tools that the Bible itself provides a basis for.
so the attempt to disprove it using logic actually relies on the very framework it's trying to attack. That's quite the turnaround.
It's a powerful point about the coherence of the biblical worldview. It provides the preconditions for rational thought itself.
Okay, let's shift gears now and decode creation itself. The 6 literal days of Genesis. This is a big one.
Huge. And the sources are emphatic. Genesis 1 is written as historical narrative.
Not poetry, not allegory, not myth.
No. And there's strong linguistic evidence for this. Hebrew scholars like Dr. Stephen Boyd have done detailed analysis,
What kind of analysis?
looking at verb forms, specifically the frequency of what's called the wa consecutive preterite verb form in Genesis 1.
Okay, technical term. What does that mean in plain English?
Think of it like the Hebrew way of saying and then. It links clauses together in a sequence of past events. And God said, and it was so, and God saw, and there was evening. That kind of structure. It's the standard way Hebrew indicates historical progression.
So this specific verb form is characteristic of historical writing, not poetry.
Overwhelmingly so. Boyd compared Genesis 1 statistically with known Hebrew historical texts and known Hebrew poetry. Genesis 1 clusters statistically with the historical narratives, not the poems.
Can you give an example comparing history and poetry in the Bible?
Sure. Look at the book of Judges. Chapter 4 tells the story of Deborah and Barak's victory over Sisera. That's historical narrative full of those sequential verbs. Then chapter 5 is the Song of Deborah. It's poetry about the same event, And the language, the verb forms, the structure are completely different. Genesis 1 reads like Judges 4, not Judges 5.
That's very clear. So this linguistic evidence directly challenges something called the framework hypothesis.
It does. The framework hypothesis tries to read Genesis 1 not chronologically, but topically. Like days 1 through 3 are about forming realms, light, dark, sky, sea, land plans, and days 4 to 6 are about filling those realms, sun, moon, birds, fish, animals, humans.
A literary structure, not a timeline.
Exactly. But the wa consecutive verbs strongly indicate a timeline, a sequence. Our sources also point out that proponents of the framework view, like Meredith Klein, were quite open about their motivation
Which was?
to basically harmonize Genesis with the scientific consensus of deep time, billions of years, to free science from, as they saw, biblical constraints on the time frame.
So it was an interpretation driven by wanting to fit in long ages, rather than letting the text speak for itself.
That's the argument presented in the sources. The plain language, in the space of 6 days, coupled with the historical verb forms, points strongly towards a straightforward, sequential understanding.
And then there's that simple phrase, evening and morning.
Right. Repeated for each of the first 6 days. Genesis 1.5, 8, 13, 19, 23, 31. What else could that mean in context besides a normal literal day? It defines the boundary of each creative period.
A 24-hour cycle.
It seems to be the most natural reading. Now, some argue about the 7th day.
Because it doesn't have the evening and morning phrase.
Correct. So they say, see, day 7 is ongoing. Maybe the other days were long too. But the counter-argument in our sources is quite clever.
What is it?
It basically says that argument backfires. If the absence of evening and morning on day 7 means it's not a normal day, then the presence of the phrase on days 1 through 6 must mean they were normal days.
The exception proves the rule, in a way. The lack of the phrase highlights its significance where it is present.
Exactly. It defines those first 6 as ordinary days. The nature of day 7, God's Sabbath rest, might be different, but it doesn't change the definition of the first 6.
And this a literal 6-day view. It's not some modern invention, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. The sources emphasize that historically this was the dominant view among major Christian scholars for centuries. People like Peter Lombard, Bonaventure, Zanchius.
The reformers, too. Luther, Calvin.
Yes, strongly so. They explicitly taught creation in the space of 6 days and held to a young earth based on biblical chronologies. Major church confessions like the Westminster Standards from the 1600s codified this view. Luther even estimated the age of the earth back in 1540 at about 5,500 years.
So this was mainstream Christian belief for a very long time.
Until the rise of deep time geology in the 18th and 19th centuries, yes.
So here's an aha moment for you, listener. Think about how that simple phrase, evening and morning, repeated 6 times, carries such immense weight. It directly impacts how we understand the age of the universe and really the historical reliability of Genesis itself. It's not just a minor detail.
It's foundational to the timeline presented.
Okay, let's move into the evidence. Our sources highlight scientific data that seems remarkably consistent with the young Earth, starting with radiometric dating.
Right. This is often presented as the slam dunk proof for billions of years.
Yeah. Textbooks, documentaries, it's treated as fact. But the sources point to a crucial, unproven assumption.
Correct. The assumption is that radioactive decay rates the speed at which elements like uranium turn into lead have been absolutely constant over vast stretches of unobserved time.
And that's just an assumption, not proven.
It's an extrapolation. A huge one, as one source puts it, 7 orders of magnitude back through immense spans of unobserved time. While decay rates seem constant today, we haven't observed them for millions or billions of years. Assuming constancy is a core tenet of uniformitarianism, but it's still an assumption about the unobserved past.
And there's evidence challenging that assumption, like the RATE project.
Yes, the RATE project, radioisotopes and the age of the Earth, found some fascinating things. They looked at tiny zircon crystals embedded in granite from New Mexico.
Okay. And what did they find?
Well, using standard uranium-lead dating assumptions, those zircons give an age of 1.5 billion years.
Right. That sounds like the standard old Earth figure.
But here's the kicker. That same uranium decay also produces helium, which is a very light, slippery gas. It should leak out of the crystals over time. They measured the amount of helium still trapped inside those tiny zircon crystals, and they found way too much helium. Based on measured leakage rates, only about 6,000 years worth of helium should still be there if the crystals were really 1.5 billion years old.
Wait, The uranium says 1.5 billion years, but the helium says maybe 6,000 years?
That's the paradox. The vast amount of helium still present strongly suggests that the nuclear decay which produced it happened much more recently or much faster in the past, or both. If the decay happened slowly over 1.5 billion years, the helium should have diffused out long ago.
So the helium retention acts like a completely different clock, giving a radically younger age.
Exactly. It points towards accelerated nuclear decay in the past. The diffusion age based on helium leakage is just a few thousand years, directly contradicting the billion-year radiometric age. It's observable evidence that challenges the constancy assumption.
That's pretty compelling. What about carbon-14?
Carbon-14 or 14C is another major challenge for long ages. It's unstable and decays relatively quickly. Its half-life is only about 5,730 years.
So it shouldn't be found in anything supposedly millions of years old.
Correct. After, say, 100,000 years at most, there should be no detectable 14C left. Yet it's routinely found in coal seams, diamonds, and even dinosaur fossils, things supposedly tens or hundreds of millions of years old.
But how is that explained? Contamination.
That's often the first explanation offered. But the levels are often significantly above background, and it's found deep within samples where contamination seems unlikely. Rigorous methods are used to prevent contamination during testing. The consistent presence of 14C in these ancient materials is a serious anomaly for the standard timeline.
So, listener, this really challenges the foundations of secular age dating. It shows that these common assumptions, like constant decay rates, can be questioned, and observable data like helium retention or 14C presence might point in a very different direction. It's about looking at all the evidence, including the anomalies.
And then there's geology. The sources point to large-scale geological features as evidence for the global flood described in Genesis.
Like sediment on the ocean floor.
Exactly. Around 20 billion tons of sediment erode off the continents and wash into the oceans every year. Tectonic plate subduction only removes about 1 billion tons.
So there's a net gain of 19 billion tons per year.
Roughly, yes. At that rate, the current average thickness of seafloor sediment, about 400 meters, would accumulate at less than 12 million years.
Which is vastly shorter than the supposed billions of years age of the ocean basins.
Right. If the oceans were billions of years old, why aren't they choked with kilometers-thick sediment? The current amount is much more consistent with a much shorter timescale, potentially including massive deposition during a recent global flood.
And the bent rock layers. That's always seemed incredible to me.
It is pretty amazing. You go to mountain ranges like the Rockies or the Appalachians or even the Grand Canyon region, and you see these massive layers of sedimentary rock, thousands of feet thick, bent into tight folds, like folds in a carpet.
Without shattering.
That's the key. They're often bent sharply without evidence of the kind of fracturing you'd expect if they were a solid, brittle rock when they were bent.
Like trying to bend hardened concrete, it just breaks.
Exactly. But if the concrete is still wet...
We can shape it easily.
Precisely. This suggests these thick layers were still soft and unconsolidated, likely saturated with water, when they were deformed by massive tectonic forces. This points to rapid deposition of the layers and then rapid deformation soon afterwards, consistent with the kind of catastrophe described in the Genesis flood. The Kaibab upwarp near the Grand Canyon is a classic example, a huge fold extending for miles.
And what about the uniformity of these layers? You'd expect a flood to be chaotic, right?
That's a common misconception. While locally chaotic, the sources describe many flood-deposited layers as being remarkably uniform in thickness and composition over vast areas, sometimes covering huge portions of continents.
How does that happen in a flood?
It points towards deposition by fast-moving, widespread sheets of water laminar flow, carrying huge amounts of sediment and laying it down relatively evenly across enormous regions. Think massive underwater sediment flows, not just local rivers overflowing. This large-scale uniformity is actually hard to explain with slow, localized uniformitarian processes over millions of years, but fits well with a global hydraulic cataclysm.
Okay, but maybe the most startling evidence mentioned is soft tissue in fossils. Dinosaur soft tissue, really.
Yes, really. Dr. Mary Schweitzer's work starting in the early 2000s has been revolutionary and, frankly, paradigm-shattering. She found what appear to be flexible, branching blood vessels, translucent tissues, and even intact cells resembling red blood cells and bone cells, osteocytes, inside a T-Rex femur, supposedly 68 million years old.
Flexible after 68 million years. How is that even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Based on known rates of chemical degradation, complex organic molecules like proteins, Collagen, elastin, hemoglobin were identified, and cellular structures simply shouldn't survive for millions of years, even under ideal preservation conditions. They should have decayed or mineralized long ago.
Has this been confirmed? Was it just contamination?
Contamination was the initial skeptical reaction, naturally, but Schweitzer and other independent labs have done rigorous testing, using multiple methods, confirming the presence of dinosaur-specific proteins and ruling out bacterial biofilms or other contaminants in many cases. Similar finds have now been reported in various other dinosaur fossils, including duck-billed dinosaurs.
So this isn't just a one-off weird finding.
No, it's becoming a pattern. And then you have things like the Lazarus bacteria.
Bacteria brought back to life.
Bacteria revived from supposedly 250-million-year-old salt crystals. But DNA analysis suggests their DNA is far too intact to be that old, maybe closer to the 4,500-year time frame since the flood. Explanations involving long-term spore survival are proposed, but they face huge challenges regarding DNA degradation rates. They often sound like rescuing devices to save the long-age paradigm.
These findings seem like powerful, direct challenges to the millions of years timeline. They point strongly towards a much more recent burial and preservation.
They absolutely do. They fit much more comfortably within a young Earth global flood model where fossils were buried thousands, not millions of years ago.
And even astronomy offers some clues, like comets.
Comets are another problem for deep time. They're basically dirty snowballs that lose a significant amount of their material every time they swing close to the sun. They also get ejected from the solar system by gravitational interactions.
So they burn out or get kicked out relatively quickly.
Yes. Their lifespan is typically measured in thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years, not billions. If the solar system were billions of years old, we shouldn't see any short-period comets left. They should all be gone by now.
But we do see them. So how is that explained in the standard model?
By hypothesizing reservoirs of replacement comets far out in the solar system, the theoretical Oort cloud, and the Kuiper belt. The Kuiper belt has been partially observed, but the much larger Oort cloud remains purely theoretical. These are essentially required add-ons to the model to explain why comets still exist if the solar system is old.
Whereas in a young solar system,
You wouldn't need these theoretical reservoirs because the comets haven't had time to burn out or be ejected yet. Their presence is perfectly consistent with a solar system that's only thousands of years old.
So another aha moment for you, listener. Consider how these observable processes, helium leakage, 14C presence, sediment rates, soft tissue survival, comet lifespans when interpreted without the assumption of deep time, seem to align remarkably well with the biblical timescale of creation and the flood. It really prompts a reevaluation of the evidence itself.
It's about asking if the interpretation fits all the data or just the data selected to fit the paradigm.
Let's pivot now to dinosaurs. Always fascinating. The sources argue they fit squarely within the biblical timeline.
Right. The word dinosaur is modern, only coined in 1841. Before that, large reptilian creatures were often called.
Dragons.
Exactly. And ancient texts, historical records, and artwork from around the world contain descriptions and depictions of these dragon-like creatures that are surprisingly consistent with what we now know about various dinosaurs and other extinct reptiles.
Like the behemoth in the Book of Job.
Job 40 describes behemoth in detail. It eats grass like an ox. Its strength is in its loins, its tail moves like a cedar tree, its bones are like tubes of bronze.
The tail, like a cedar tree, that doesn't fit an elephant or hippo, which some commentators suggest.
Not at all. But it fits perfectly with the massive, thick tail of a large sauropod dinosaur, like Brachiosaurus or Apatosaurus. The description of its feeding habits also matches sauropods stripping vegetation, possibly swallowing stones, gastroliths, for digestion. It's a remarkably accurate description if Job was seeing a sauropod.
And these accounts aren't just biblical.
No, they're global. Sumerian epics like Gilgamesh mention slaying a dragon. European records, like Ulysses Aldrovandus' account from 1572 Italy, describe a dragon killed by a peasant that sounds uncannily like the fossil reptile Tenestropheus. There are ancient Chinese dragon stories, South American artifacts, North American petroglyphs.
Like the one in Utah that looks like a sauropod.
Yes, the Kachina Bridge petroglyph. All these suggest that humans, throughout history and across cultures, encountered creatures we would now classify as dinosaurs or similar large reptiles.
So the perspective shift is, Adam saw dinosaurs, humans lived alongside them.
That's the implication. They weren't separated by millions of years, they were part of the original creation that humans interacted with. Dragons became myth only after the real creatures became rare or extinct.
This connects directly to the fall then. Genesis 1 says everything was originally very good.
And specifically, Genesis 1.2930 states that humans and all animals were originally vegetarian. There was no death, no carnivory before sin entered the world through Adam's disobedience.
So death, suffering, thorns, animals eating each other, that all came after the fall as part of the curse.
Correct. Genesis 3 describes the curse on the ground, bringing thorns and thistles. Romans 5.12 explicitly links death to Adam's sin. Romans 8 talks about the whole creation groaning under the effects of the fall. 1 Corinthians 15 calls death an enemy.
And here's the conflict with long ages again.
It's a direct contradiction. If the fossil record represents millions of years before humans, then it represents millions of years of death, disease, suffering, and carnivory thorns and rocks, animals eating each other, evidence of cancer and dinosaur bones all happening before Adam sinned.
Which completely undermines the biblical teaching that death is the consequence of sin.
Exactly. It makes death part of God's original very good creation, not an intrusion caused by rebellion. This has huge theological implications for the meaning of Christ's death overcoming the curse of death.
Okay, so if dinosaurs lived alongside humans, how did they survive the flood? Did Noah take T-Rexes onto the ark?
Well, the ark was built to save representatives of every kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing animal. That would include dinosaur kinds.
But there are so many dinosaur species. How could they fit?
We need to think in terms of biblical kinds, which are broader than modern species, like one dog kind giving rise to wolves, coyotes, dingoes, and all domestic breeds. Estimates suggest there might have been fewer than 50 distinct dinosaur kinds that needed to be on the ark.
And Noah wouldn't have needed fully grown giants.
Probably not. It makes more sense he would have taken juveniles or young adults. Easier to handle, less space, less food, and they'd have their reproductive lives ahead of them after the flood. The ark itself was huge, plenty of room according to its biblical dimensions.
And the flood itself explains the fossils?
It provides the mechanism. The global flood, burying billions of creatures rapidly in sediment-laden water, is the best explanation for the vast fossil graveyards we find worldwide. Animals not on the ark, including most dinosaurs, would have perished and been buried, creating the fossil record we see today, around 4,500 years ago.
Okay, final dinosaur point. They did not evolve into birds.
The sources are very clear on this. Dinosaurs have always been dinosaurs and birds have always been birds. They state there's no credible evidence for this transition.
Despite things like Archaeopteryx or other feathered dinosaurs.
Archaeopteryx is often cited, but it had fully formed flight feathers, claws on its wings, teeth. It looks more like a unique mosaic creature, fully bird in some ways, reptilian in others. It doesn't show a gradual transition of scales into feathers or reptile lungs into bird lungs.
The lungs are a key difference.
A massive difference. Bird lungs have a unique, highly efficient flow-through system with air sacs, completely different from the bellows-like lungs of reptiles. Fossils like Sinosauropteryx, a supposed feathered dinosaur, actually show evidence of a more crocodile-like respiratory system, contradicting the idea it was on the way to becoming a bird.
So a feathered dinosaur, if truly feathered, might just be a feathered dinosaur, a unique created kind.
Exactly. Like a platypus is a unique mosaic. It doesn't prove evolution between major groups. The anatomical gaps, especially in fundamental systems like respiration, remain vast and unbridged by fossil evidence.
That definitely challenges the standard museum narrative.
It certainly does.
Let's look now at the Bible's historical reliability, touching on archaeology and prophecy. Archaeology doesn't prove the Bible, but it often corroborates it.
Yes, and sometimes in ways that silence long-standing skepticism. King David is a prime example.
Critics used to say he was just a myth.
For a long time, yes. Some scholars claimed he was invented centuries later. There was no direct archaeological evidence mentioning him.
Until the Tel Dan inscription.
Exactly. Discovered in 1993, this stone fragment from the 9th century BC explicitly mentions the House of David, referring to the dynasty of Judah. This was written only about 150 years after David's reign, confirming his historical reality and dynasty long before critics claimed he was invented. It forced a major reassessment.
And prophecy provides another line of evidence.
A powerful one. Think of the detailed prophecies about the destruction of cities like Tyre or Nineveh. Nahum predicted Nineveh's fall by flood and fire, which happened exactly as described in 612 BC.
But the messianic prophecies are even more specific.
Incredibly so, written centuries before Jesus lived. Micah 5.2 pinpointing Bethlehem as his birthplace. Zechariah 9.9 describing his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on a donkey. Psalm 22 giving a graphic description of crucifixion, pierced hands and feet, divided garments centuries before crucifixion was widely practiced by the Romans. Isaiah 53 detailing his suffering, death, and burial with the rich.
The sheer number and specificity make coincidence seem improbable.
Highly improbable. It points towards divine foreknowledge, something beyond human predictive abilities.
And Israel's unique monotheism, that stands out historically.
Massively. In a world saturated with polytheism, gods for everything, ancient Israel maintained a radical belief in one transcendent creator God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This wasn't a gradual evolution of religious thought. It was foundational and countercultural, suggesting a divine revelation rather than human invention.
Okay, let's focus on the central event, Christ's resurrection, presented as an essential historical fact.
Absolutely non-negotiable in the sources. 1 Corinthians 15 is clear. If Christ wasn't raised, faith is futile, preaching is useless, and believers are still in their sins. It's the cornerstone.
And the evidence rests heavily on eyewitness testimony.
Yes. God ensured numerous varied eyewitnesses saw the risen Christ. These weren't secondhand accounts initially. They were direct experiences that transformed lives.
Can you list some of those appearances?
Mary Magdalene at the tomb, other women, the 2 disciples on the Emmaus Road, Peter, then the 10 disciples, without Thomas, huddled in fear, then the disciples with Thomas who needed physical proof.
Seeing the wounds.
Yes. Then a large group of over 500 people at once, mentioned by Paul, who noted many were still alive and could be questioned. James, Jesus' own skeptical brother who became a leader in the Jerusalem church after seeing the risen Christ. And finally, Paul himself, the persecutor, dramatically converted on the Damascus Road.
That range of witnesses, individually and in groups, is significant.
Very. And their subsequent behavior is powerful evidence. These weren't people gaining power or wealth. They faced persecution, beatings, imprisonment, and ultimately horrific deaths.
And they never recanted.
Never. They maintained their testimony that they had seen the risen Jesus. People might die for what they believe is true, but they don't willingly suffer and die for something they know is a lie they helped create. Their unwavering conviction points to the reality of their experience.
And Jesus himself claimed to be divine. This wasn't just something his followers made up later.
The Gospels record numerous instances. I and my Father are one, John 10:30. Before Abraham was, I am, John 8:58, using God's covenant name. Forgiving sins, accepting worship. The Jewish leaders understood exactly what he was claiming, equality with God, which is why they accused him of blasphemy and wanted to stone him.
And early church writings confirm this belief was there from the beginning, not invented at Nicaea.
Absolutely. Church fathers like Ignatius, writing very early in the 2nd century, long before the Council of Nicaea 325 AD, clearly speak of Jesus Christ as God. Lactantius, Arnobius, writing before Nicaea too. The belief in Christ's deity was foundational from the start, based on his own claims and his resurrection, not a later political invention.
Okay, one last point here. Understanding miracles, not as violations of natural law,
but as unusual manifestations of God's power designed to accomplish a specific purpose. God consistently upholds the universe, that's his providence, but a miracle is when he acts in an extraordinary, attention-getting way to authenticate a message or messenger or achieve a redemptive goal.
And the Hebrew words used emphasize different aspects.
Yes, shu means a sign, pointing beyond the event itself to God's power and purpose. Mufeth means a wonder, evoking awe and confirming the divine source. Palah highlights something extraordinary or difficult, emphasizing God's power to do what is humanly impossible. Miracles are purposeful, powerful, and point to God.
So, listener, the takeaway is strong. The Bible presents itself as historically reliable, backed by archaeology, fulfilled prophecy, and most importantly, the powerful evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It invites reasoned faith, not blind belief.
A faith grounded in historical events and claims.
Now, this leads us into worldviews in conflict, the biblical basis for science, logic, morality itself. It's crucial, the sources say, to distinguish observational from historical science.
Yes, this distinction is fundamental. Observational science is what we do in the present. It's testable, repeatable, verifiable through our senses and experiments. Building technology, testing medicines, observing planetary orbits today, that's observational science.
And creationists are fully on board with this.
Absolutely. Many scientific pioneers were creationists. This kind of science works regardless of your beliefs about origin.
But historical science is different.
It deals with the past, trying to reconstruct events that are unobservable, unrepeatable, and untestable directly, like how the Grand Canyon formed, or the origin of life, or the evolution of species over millions of years.
And this involves assumptions.
Always. You have to make assumptions about past conditions, about the constancy of rates, like decay rates or erosion rates, about processes you weren't there to see. These assumptions are often based on your worldview.
So the evidence, the rocks, the fossils, is the same for everyone.
Yes, the physical data is the same. A creationist and an evolutionist look at the same fossil in the same rock layer,
But they interpret it differently.
radically differently, because they start with different historical frameworks, different assumptions about the past. One assumes a biblical history of recent creation and a global flood. The other assumes a naturalistic history of deep time and slow processes. The worldview dictates the interpretation of the evidence.
Okay, so what about the biblical prerequisite for knowledge itself? How does science depend on a biblical foundation?
Science fundamentally assumes that the universe is orderly, logical, and governed by consistent laws that can be discovered and described mathematically. This is the principle of uniformity.
Why is that dependent on the Bible?
Because the biblical worldview provides a reason for that uniformity. An unchanging, rational, law-giving God created and sustains an orderly universe. Why else should the universe be so consistently lawful and comprehensible?
What about from a purely naturalistic viewpoint?
If the universe is just the product of random chance and mindless processes, there's no inherent reason to expect such deep, reliable order. Philosophers like Hume pointed out, you can't logically prove that the future will be like the past just because it always has been. The Christian worldview provides the grounding. God's faithfulness guarantees nature's consistency.
And the same applies to logic.
Yes, laws of logic like non-contradiction are universal, unchanging, abstract truths. They aren't physical things.
They can't put them in a test tube.
Exactly. So, for a materialist who believes only matter and energy are real, where do these non-material laws of logic come from? How can they be universally binding?
They just are.
That's usually the assertion, but it lacks a foundation within materialism. The Christian worldview says logic reflects the mind of God. It's rooted in his rational nature. So when an atheist uses logic to argue, they're using a tool that their own worldview cannot actually account for. They're borrowing from theism.
And morality, too. Objective right and wrong.
Same problem. If humans are just evolved animals, products of a purposeless material process, on what objective basis can we say something is truly wrong or right?
It just becomes personal preference or social convention.
Ultimately, yes. There's no ultimate authority or standard. Actions are just chemical reactions or survival behaviors. Terms like good and evil lose their objective meaning. The biblical worldview grounds morality in the unchanging character and commands of a holy God, providing a real basis for right and wrong.
And the sources argue that rejecting this biblical basis has had terrible consequences.
They draw a direct line between evolutionary thinking, particularly the idea of survival of the fittest, applied to human societies, and the devaluation of human life to mere animal status, and some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century.
Like Nazism and communism.
Yes, Nazi ideology was steeped in social Darwinism, viewing certain races as inferior and needing to be eliminated for the health of the species. Communist regimes under Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot were explicitly atheistic and materialistic, viewing individuals as expendable cogs in the machine of the state or evolutionary progress, leading to tens of millions of deaths. The argument is that when you remove the biblical foundation of inherent human value derived from being made in God's image, these kinds of horrors become philosophically possible, even logical extensions of the worldview.
That's a sobering connection. Okay, let's challenge some specific evolutionary narratives with biblical truth, starting with cavemen.
Right. The popular image is of grunting, primitive, ape-like creatures. But the Bible describes the earliest humans, right after creation, as intelligent and capable.
Building cities, making music, working metal.
Genesis 4 mentions Cain building a city, Jubal making musical instruments, Tubal-Cain forging bronze and iron. This doesn't sound like primitive brutes.
And archaeology supports this view of early humans being intelligent.
Increasingly so. Finds associated with Neanderthals show complex tool use, burial rituals suggesting belief in an afterlife, use of pigments, perhaps even jewelry. Homo erectus remains suggest cooperative hunting, care for the weak, and even seafaring capabilities. Denisovans left behind sophisticated jewelry. These aren't ape men. They're fully human, displaying intelligence, creativity, and culture consistent with being made in God's image, just living in different conditions or exhibiting variations within the human family.
What about Haeckel's embryos, the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny?
That idea that an embryo's development replays its species' evolutionary history was based on drawings by Ernst Haeckel that are now known to be fraudulent. He exaggerated similarities.
So human embryos don't actually have gill slits.
No, they have pharyngeal pouches, which in fish develop into gills, but in humans develop into parts of the ear and throat. The theory has been scientifically debunked for decades, yet it still lingers in some textbooks because it was such a powerful visual argument for evolution. It's an example of how a persuasive but false idea can persist.
Okay, what about beneficial mutations? Isn't that how evolution creates novelty?
The sources argue that the mutations we observe, even the ones considered beneficial in the specific environment, don't actually create fundamentally new genetic information or novel traits needed for large-scale evolution.
Like antibiotic resistance in bacteria.
Right. That often involves a loss or modification of existing information. For example, a mutation might break a protein that normally transports the antibiotic into the cell, making the bacterium resistant but potentially less fit in other ways. Or think of fish in dark caves losing their eyes that's beneficial in the cave, but it's a loss of information, not a gain.
So these are adaptations maybe, but not the kind of changes needed to turn a reptile into a bird.
Exactly. They involve tweaking existing systems, not building new ones from scratch. There's no known mutation that adds the kind of complex, specified information needed for molecules to man evolution.
And this contrasts sharply with epigenetics.
Yes, epigenetics is fascinating. It involves mechanisms above the DNA sequence chemical tags that switch genes on or off in response to the environment.
And these changes can be inherited.
Some can, yes. It allows organisms to adapt rapidly, sometimes within a generation, in a targeted, non-random way. It looks much more like a pre-programmed design system for adaptation and resilience than random trial and error mutations.
Like God built in the ability to adapt to a changing world.
That's how the sources present it. A reflection of God's foresight, equipping creatures to thrive even in the challenging conditions after the fall. It points strongly towards intelligent design, not mindless evolution.
Lastly, let's touch on modern biotechnology GMOs. How do biblical principles apply?
The starting point is the dominion mandate in Genesis 1, God giving humanity responsibility to care for and manage creation.
Which implies stewardship, not exploitation.
Right. The sources argue that genetic modification, when done responsibly, can be seen as a modern form of artificial selection, similar to what humans have done for millennia with plant breeding, grafting, hybridization, and animal husbandry.
Practice is not condemned in the Bible.
No. Paul even uses grafting as an analogy in Romans 11. There's no explicit biblical prohibition against modifying genetic material within kinds.
What about the Leviticus verse about not mixing seeds?
Leviticus 19.19 refers to planting different kinds of seeds together in the same field, likely part of Israel's specific laws related to maintaining distinctions or avoiding pagan practices. It's not seen as a ban on genetic science itself.
So the approach should be one of caution and stewardship, but not outright rejection.
That's the view presented. Acknowledge public concerns, conduct thorough testing to ensure safety for humans and the environment, but recognize that GMOs, used wisely, could be a legitimate tool within our mandate to manage creation, potentially helping increase food production for a needy world. It's about responsible application.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground. We set out on this deep dive to really get under the hood of the Bible's truth claims, its authority, and specifically that foundational account of creation in 6 literal days.
And hopefully we've shown how this isn't just an abstract theological idea, but something that provides a robust, coherent framework for understanding pretty much everything.
So for you, our listener, let's recap the key takeaways. First, the sources present the Bible not merely as a religious guide, but as the supreme authoritative history of the universe given by the Creator himself.
Second, a literal reading of the 6-day creation in Genesis isn't just based on faith. It's strongly supported by the Hebrew language itself, and surprisingly perhaps, aligns well with a lot of scientific evidence when you question the standard long-age assumptions. Evidence like rapid fossilization, bent rock layers, soft tissue survival, healing retention.
Things that don't fit neatly into the millions of years story. And third, this biblical worldview provides, arguably, the only solid rational foundation for the very tools we use to understand the world's science, logic, objective morality. Other worldviews seem to borrow these concepts without being able to justify them internally.
It offers coherent answers, where naturalism or other non-biblical worldviews often struggle or fall into self-contradiction.
So as you reflect on all this God's 6-day creation, the incredible design, the built-in adaptability we see in life, Here's a final provocative thought to ponder.
If the Creator himself has given us an infallible eyewitness account of history, revealing a purposeful six-day creation, and that account aligns so perfectly with so much of what we can observe today when we critically examine the evidence and its underlying assumptions.
What then does it mean for your approach to all other knowledge? And maybe more importantly, how might you choose to live in light of potentially inhabiting such a profoundly ordered, purposefully created, and, well, deeply personal world?